As we explore this posture, we want to do two things. First, understand how the posture teaches itself to you. And that's a really important part of how in each one we have this idea of negative lineage but also intuitive development. And that can only happen if you can explore postures intuitively, and that can only happen if they can somehow teach themselves to you. And secondly, we want to look at the process of cultivation, how a movement can go from bigger to smaller. So the movement itself, the actual forearm strike, isn't going to get smaller, but the body movement that we put into it, we're going to start with a bigger movement and then move on to a smaller movement. And let's start that understanding with the easiest part of the posture to make smaller, which is the other arm. So to generate the most force, the easiest way would be to use a lot of centrifugal force and just swing the other arm backwards, which is a good negative example of release force in every direction, because we don't want to be just randomly throwing our arm out backwards. It could hit anything, things that we don't want it to hit, get injured, but most of all it leaves us even more open. So we follow our quintessence principle of wushu and bring the arm in. And by now we should know that we compensate for that loss of volume by using screwing force, or it's sometimes interchangeably used with the concept of spiral force. I usually use spiral force to mean the whole body moving in a phased movement, but screwing force is usually the term we mean for a limb when it just twists, and by twisting creates more volume within itself. And unfortunately in each one we do have this curse of various individuals who mislead the people by giving obscure meanings to very straightforward terms. So just to emphasize that this really is screwing force, here's a very short quote from Yao Zongzun. When issuing force, the upper arm rotates forward, twisting and coiling outwards. This is the so-called screwing force. It's just that in this case the arm is moving backwards because he's describing a slightly different posture. He's describing a punch, but we're describing what the other arm is doing, but it's the same principle. And as we do that, our whole posture is going to open. So the quad is going to open and the chest and shoulder areas are also going to open. It's a big wide use of open throughout the whole structure of the body. And as we do that, our posture leans back. So we don't lean into the strike. We lean back, arm goes forward, and then the opposite shoulder goes back. And that in itself creates more volume in the posture. And remember that we are trying to maximize force, because so much of the force that we generate will be lost through the weakness of the structure. And the simplest way to do that is to add more volume to the overall posture. So now let's look at how the posture itself teaches you that, how it's embedded within the logic of the movement itself. And if we look again at this video where I'm demonstrating how to stack the posture incorrectly, I'm not just swinging my arm back massively, I'm also trying to compensate for the loss of force by making the muscle alignment much tighter, much more like a hook, so a much smaller movement, decreasing the volume. And just like a hook, I'm then rotating round my central axis. And the problem with that is that the hitting point of your arm is then at the wrong angle. So it's more like you're swinging in, you're trying to hit with the forearm, but if your opponent is in front of you, you're hitting them in the back of the head rather than in the side of the head. And that also loses a massive amount of force because it's like you're pulling them towards you. But if you want to pull them towards you, that's absolutely not the way that you do that posture. That's just like tapping them in the back of the head. For all the big movement, it's all dissipated, all the force goes elsewhere. So the posture itself teaches you, it tells you that you can't cheat it. You've got to elongate your arm. Lengthen the arm out, and you do that by using open quite dramatically from the quad and from the upper body. So you open at the quad, push the lead hip forwards, and then widen the quad, and then at the same time the whole upper body flattens out and uses open as well. As a consequence of that, the rear shoulder is going backwards, and that means you're creating more volume, but you're also foreshortening the posture. So the hit point is going to be closer to you than it would be, for example, if you leant forwards with the posture. But the posture itself teaches you that you have to do it like this. Also notice that my lead foot is flat on the floor first. And remember that we want to use explosive force and hit at the centre line. And if you try this posture yourself, you'll immediately feel that if you keep your foot flat on the floor, that it puts a strain on the point where the leg goes into the hip, puts a strain on the muscles and the tendons there. And you can feel immediately that if you were to do this explosively, that there's a potential for causing an injury there. So the posture itself teaches you that this isn't the right way or the best way to do it. And think about all those discussions that people have around pivot routes in Yiquan and whether you should use a pivot route, as if it's just a matter of a cultural set where someone's made a decision to do that. No, that's not the case. It's not arbitrary. The posture itself teaches you to do this, and also it helps you to create more explosive force because it helps to relax the posture in that split second where you use Fa Li. And then once you do this, the pivot route itself begins to teach you that it's overdetermined, that there's lots of other things that flow from this. For example, it's much more difficult to use spiral force if we don't lift the foot off the floor. But remember that we're also trying to make the movement smaller, although it would be more accurate to say we're trying to make it more compact. So we want to take the big swing that we would have done with the arms and put that somewhere else, in this case in the extra movement that we're creating in the leg with the pivot route. So the pivot route in this case adds a little bit of rise. Usually when we use rise, the torso rises more, the shoulders rise more with it, but it's just a little bit of rise in the leg, maybe 5% rise added into the mix. But combined with the spiral force that we've now added into the leg, that creates more volume, therefore more power, and every little helps. And remember back to the beginner series when we were learning about the hook punch in Yiquan, and we learned that it's a very small movement and that we really want to maximise every possible means of adding force into the posture. And one of the things that the posture itself teaches us is that the pivot route can do something else. It can brace the punch, which is to say, as long as we time it and position it right, the ball of the foot can push out, and then that will help us to push into the target when we throw the punch, and that will add a little bit of force in. And remember that to maximise this effect according to physiology and the laws of physics, the pivot route has to be pointing towards the hit point. And that means this is a very short movement. The heel just comes up a little bit because the hook punch is such a short posture. But look at the way the posture moves everything back down onto the back foot. Everything pushes down onto the back leg and just tips the posture back a little bit. And that's why it all sets down onto the back leg. That's where all the weight is, and that's where all the pressure goes down into the floor. The front foot just braces it. And you tell me, the front foot is bracing the posture, but the energy is going down the back leg. That's where it's setting the posture and solidifying it. So which one is the kinetic chain? And the answer to that is that the whole idea of kinetic chains is really very primitive. There's so much more going on when we understand the real science of Chinese Wushu. So now let's apply that knowledge and say, well, what happens when we change the posture from the hook into the forearm strike? So lots of things are the same in terms of the bracing and the pressure going down the back leg, but the direction that the pivot route points towards is still the hit point, but now the hit point is extended, so the pivot route has got to change slightly. But here's where it gets into much more subtle movement, because the actual direction of the pivot route, although it is pointing towards the hit point, you hardly feel that change. But there's a change in the way that you stack the leg on its own in relation to the pivot route. And that's because you're opening much more than you would do with a hook, and that is something you'll feel in your inner thigh. And that's also why you need to be working on a little bit of flexibility as well, because if you do that movement explosively, big open movement, you can pull that muscle quite easily. But the most important thing is that the posture itself then begins to teach us about spiral force, because when we do the hook, it's like we just pull back with the rear arm, push up off the foot, and the whole movement happens simultaneously, explosively around the central axis. But you can't do that with this posture. It's a different posture. You have to open the body. So it's like you unfold around the axis rather than turning around the axis. You'll get it if you actually try the posture. You'll see what I mean. And it's not easy to generate force like that. And this is the thing that the posture then begins to teach us, because we want to generate as much force as possible, but that's a much more cultivated step forward to be able to generate force just from that posture alone, just using open. I'm going to show you how to do that, but first of all, we have to learn step by step. We have to follow this process of cultivation. And what the posture suggests to you, in and of itself, the posture itself, just naturally as you play with it, suggests this, that if you just move forward a little bit with your right side, if you're hitting with the left hand, and you just move the right side of your body forwards just a little bit before you do the posture, then you add in a little bit of extra power. You can move the right side forward and then rapidly change that into moving the left side forward. In other words, you use close and then open as a spiral movement to slingshot the hit out. And just look again very closely at the difference between the hook, which is just moving around the central axis, and this movement, which is now spiral force. I mean, there's so much nonsense talked about this stuff, but you can physically see it. Okay, so now we're here, let's just recap something else as well. So we can see the posture, we can see the way it leans back, we can see that it sets on the back leg, all the force is going back into that back leg, and that isn't force coming from the floor. That's a very primitive way of thinking about it. We set the posture, we solidify it, so in a sense it feels like the force is coming from the floor, but just like well, Wang Shangjai calls it rebound energy, so that gives you a very clear indication of what's actually happening. And you can also see that the pivoting heel doesn't come out very far because it doesn't have to, it's just pointing towards the hip point. And now remember from when we first learned about pivot roots that there's a rule, we don't lean over them, and the reason is that we can easily buckle the ankle. But the reason that we might want to do it, and remember I've always said intent is a dog, it's not some kind of spiritual force, it's a dog. It will try and maximise force, that's the one instruction that it obeys. And you very often have to overrule it because, for example, one of the ways that it can help to improve or maximise force is to throw all your weight forwards into the posture, in which case that would take you right over your pivot root. So it's overdetermined that you have to lean backwards in this way. Okay, let's get back to our improvement of power generation by using close and then open. And here in this very simple exercise, you can see the rear hip comes forward. But what I want you to notice particularly is as you move back, the pivot root comes up. So this is another element of cultivation, which is timing. Timing everything in the posture right so that everything leads into generating the maximum possible effect at the hit point. And by comparison, if we look again at the hook, we can see that the timing is completely different. Everything happens instantaneously. The lead foot goes up, the rear hand screws back, and the punch goes out. It's all one movement. So if it was a count of a beat, it would just be one. And if you do a very similar posture for the forearm strike to the hook, the force generation, the generation of kinetic force is very similar, but the transmission of that force is very different. The very open posture of the forearm strike dissipates a massive amount of force, whereas the tighter muscle alignment of the hook, the forearm behind the fist and the more solid hitting surface of the fist transmits much more force in the hook. In fact, the loss of power through dissipation of force caused by the nature of the structure can be so dramatic that it makes the posture pointless for most people to do. And that's why we begin compensating for it with the spiral force movement. It adds volume back into the posture and slingshots more power into it. And that then begins to teach us something very interesting about timing, which is going to aid our cultivation enormously. To understand this, let's strip everything back to just using open again. So everything now happens at the same time. The screwing force with the arm, and the arm goes out for the hit, and everything hits the lock point in a count of one. Critically, you can see that the screwing force in the rear arm is timed so that when you hit the lock point elbowing fully back, at exactly the same time you hit the pivot root and the forearm strike hits and locks out at the centre line. And remember, by the way, that this point that Wang Shangjai student Zhao Daoxing calls the lock point is what Wang Shangjai describes as the most important aspect of Yiquan, the force transmission when the whole structure suddenly locks into that one point to transmit the force. And that doesn't change when we use spiral force, so the end point of the posture is going to be exactly the same. It's the beginning of the posture that's going to change because we're going to add in a little bit of close to create the spiral. i.e. create more volume and more slingshot power in the strike. So you can see here the right hip comes forward, so that's close, and then smoothly flows in the figure of 8 posture into the strike. And now the timing is 1-2, 1-2. See the difference with the hook is just 1, and then now it's 1-2, 1-2. And well done, because you've now learned how to use spiral force, and you've learned it very simply through this concept of close flowing into open. And if you look carefully, you'll see that I'm actually using sync, so I'm exaggerating the posture a little bit, but you can do this to add extra volume. So sync and close, then that figure of 8s into open and rise. And you can practice that initially with this very simple exercise, just moving the right hip forward, or whichever hip is back, moving it forward and just dropping it slightly as the leg twists in. And from there, just start to bring in the elbow back, and try and time it with the lock point, so we don't need to bring in the hip first. Just get the feeling right. And then bring up the other arm. Just think about how the timing works, and the back arm whips it all round. And then try and string it all together. Most of the work for this is done through standing and slow movement, I have to say, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but for now this is how we just initially start to practice it, so just starting to put it all together. Point being, we need to cultivate it to get it smaller, so we have to be able to do it and then work on it in standing. Standing is our laboratory. By the way, notice this posture carefully, this rising arm block, which is straight out of Shaolin. This is what I was talking about in the previous video. This is why Wang Xiangjai thought the original Shaolin Chuan was something like this. You can see where it comes from, it just becomes formalised over time. Couldn't be any more Shaolin. Also notice with this posture how it helps you understand the difference between setting and bracing, so you can really feel that the lead leg just braces the posture against the hip. But it's the back leg, the way the back leg pushes down into the floor. Feel that energy all just push back down into the floor. That's where the posture is setting. And that's what we mean when we say that rooting is much more complex than just being balanced or hard to move. Bracing and setting are two critical, important aspects of how rooting functions. Now let's focus on some of the smaller elements of power generation that you might not notice at first. So starting with the leg and the way that the lead leg pushes forwards first, and this is going to teach us about phased movement within the spiral movement. So the spiral actually moves first from, well, it's a combination of things, but it's the push up with the foot, but it's the knee that's visible first, but it spirals up from the knee and below, and then the quad, and then the chest, and out into the hip point. Actually the head moves last, it's the last thing, the last part of the spiral, but we'll come to that in a moment. But you can clearly see that it's a spiral posture, as exactly explained in the old Wushu manuals on Taiji Chuan, Xingyi Chuan and so on. And if I do it full power and then slow it down, you can see that when I do it full speed, full power, that spiral is still there. You train it slow and then you do it fast. And although when you do it fast, that little element of close into open is a little bit less visible, from the rear you can see that it's there. Just a little turn in. It's reduced because that's cultivation, but it's there. I'm just adding in as much as I can possibly get away with without it being a tell, just to add a bit of extra volume. And then next, notice the shoulders and the head. So the shoulders lift up, so that's inevitable because you're lifting your arms up, and Yao Zhongzhen says your shoulders have to just hunch a little bit. Even if you're just throwing a normal punch, that's natural because you're lifting your arms, but it's not the same thing as tensing your shoulders. If you tense your shoulders, you can't get the speed and power, can't get the velocity into the posture. But then the next thing to notice is the movement of the head. You see how the head is turning over to the side like that? If you try to do this posture without doing that, you'll break your own neck. But it also adds power into the posture. It's actually the final part of the spiral, or it's at the hip point hits and then the head just carries on a little bit more, and you can see it a lot better from this angle. And it's more pronounced because this is a more advanced version of the posture that I'm going to look at in a second. And so I'm trying to generate as much force as possible, and that's part of it. Just adding in that extra, every possible bit of movement, including the head movement, but you can really clearly see how it's the final part of the spiral. It's like my head's popping off. Well, that's just adding in that little extra bit of zing onto the posture. And then once again, full speed for this version. Try and notice all the different elements of it. And again from another angle and a couple of different sides. A picture paints 1,000 words, so have a look at this and just try and learn as much as you can visibly from the posture. Okay, so we've got this version, but through standing and slow movement we want to eventually make this posture smaller. So we want to take this movement of close out of the posture and change it so that we just use open again. So it kind of takes us back to the initial problem of where we're going to put that volume. How are we going to get more power into the posture if we take close out of it? How do we solve that problem in a different way? Well, we just continue with the same idea. We take the extra volume that we added in with close and we add it in somewhere else. No, not like this with the cheat, with the step. A much more sophisticated way. And remember that before we solved the problem by just adding in this extra bit of close here. So we add in this much volume. So that's the amount of volume that we've got to place somewhere else. How do we do that and where can we put it? Well, that just gives us an idea of measurement. We probably can't put all of that hip movement back in somewhere else, but what we can do is through cultivation make our posture more efficient. You know, like the government's always going on about more efficiency in terms of savings. Well, we've got to do that within our movement. We've got to make it faster, sharper, knitted together more efficiently so that we generate more kinetic force in the first place. And that's all a matter of cultivation, and that's all a matter of standing and slow movement and far lead practice. Secondly, we've got to change the way that we use our shoulder movement and put some extra volume in there. So if you think about the way we normally do a hook, where it just kind of sticks in, well, instead we've got to phase the movement. See? Instead of the right hip coming forward, the right shoulder comes forward. Phasing the movement is always our go-to when we want to create more volume in a posture, and then we've got to interlink that phase with the rooting, with the farley, with the hit and stop. But that's when we start benefiting from economies of scale. Everything starts knitting together into a whole body movement, and the outcome is much bigger than the sum of the parts. And when you do it fast, most of it just isn't visible to the naked eye, but it's all happening inside the body, and you can feel it in the tendons and the muscles critically, and you can feel it in the structure, but someone watching it can't necessarily see it. As the saying goes in Yiquan, the intent should not be visible. The intent tightens and then it hits, and that's it. And just look again one more time at the difference between the hook and the phased movement, so the difference between the hook posture and the phased shoulder posture. Hook, just dip straight in. Phased, 1-2, 1-2. So you bring that 1-2 timing back in, but it's so fast it's not visible. And the only way that you can really see that the phase is there is with the head, the movement of the head. It's the movement from completing the phase that's in the shoulders, but the phase in the shoulders is interlinked with the phase in the whole body now. And that's where we get the economies of scale. But there is something else we can do that will add in that extra force that we've lost. So the shoulders can only do so much, but what we can do is remember that Yao Cheng Rong hook where he uses that lean over. We can actually add a little bit more in of that, just shifting our whole body weight, our whole torso over. Remember I called it torso farley. And then all that really remains for us is to do a big majority of the work in developing this posture through standing. So visualizing the posture, so imagining the posture, feeling it in the body, and then getting the feeling as small as possible. You can use micro movements, or you can take it down to absolute stillness where you're just visualizing or triggering, finding that liminal point between thinking about the posture and experiencing some kind of physical movement of it, or indeed tickling the dog. And then going back to the bigger posture, using closing to open, changing it into small movements. You can have it as one big smooth movement, or add lots of little lock points in to build your cultivation. That's how I do it, and then working up to the lock point. And we're building the feeling of the posture into the body so strongly that you can even just feel it while you're lying in bed. So this is one of the amazing things about Yiquan, and it's very hard for people to get their mind around, but you can just think about postures and improve them. Not on their own, but if you have the physical posture, you can think about the feeling and you can practice it in your mind, and then bring it into standing, then bring it into physical movement. All of that adds up because it's about training the programming. It might sound absurd, but no one would think it was absurd that you could tinker with a computer program before it actually did the job. A machine for building cars, you can work on the programming before it actually builds a car. It's exactly the same thing. So if you can visualize it and feel it, then you can access that liminal zone between physical movement and mental induction. And remember that the best way of training it isn't just to keep doing it as hard as you possibly can, as many times as you possibly can. That's not the correct training method in Yiquan. We build up step by step from the basics of the movement. And once you've got all that, then you can start bringing all those things back in, all those extra ways of creating volume, adding in extra postures, movement of the arms and so on, and that's just what the old Wushu or Yiquan masters of the past did.